Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Hi. Brilliant to see everyone coming in so early. We've also got the fund coordinator team sitting in one big meeting room, so you can wave to everyone. We're just filling up the room here. We'll get started in a minute or two. But as we do, it'd be great for everyone to just pop their names and where they're calling in from into the chat. And we'll get started in sort of a minute or two as we wait for everyone to come in. Hi, Gabrielle. Hi, John. All right, as everyone is joining, and thanks to those who've just come, we've also got the fund coordinator in the room, well, in a meeting room. So there's a big group of people as well here in Melbourne, in the Melbourne office here. So just like to welcome everyone to the session today. And start with an acknowledgement of country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, the Water for Women Fund acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Torres Strait Islander people today. And thanks very much for joining. As there's many people on the call, please pop your name and where you're calling from and the lands that you're calling in from into the chat so we can introduce to each other. And I'd also like to introduce you to our climate advisor, Aaron Buncle, who is joining us here also in the Melbourne office, and he's coming from Outside Partners. He's been supporting the fund coordinator to develop an appraisal mechanism for the WASH activities against the OECD DAC Rio Markers for climate. So today's session is about the Rio Markers. So it's providing firstly an overview of the OECD DAC Rio Markers for climate, an overview of the appraisal mechanism that's currently in design. We will be having a breakout into 3 groups to discuss that appraisal mechanism and ensure that this is adapted into the WASH sector and for Water for Women projects. And we'll have a dedicated Q&A session. So thanks everyone for joining. People are putting their names and where they're calling in from into the chat. Just a couple of little pieces of housekeeping from this side. We will have 1.5 hours to fit into everyone's busy day. So we'll do what we can and we'll keep to time. Please use the chat for questions. We'll also be able to address those during the session. We have a dedicated Q&A session, and as we go through the content of today's webinar as well. So I will now hand over to Aaron to take us through slides, starting with the introduction of the Rio Markers and take it from there.
Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be with you all. Is my... Oh, no, sorry. It's not letting me change slides anymore. Sorry, 1 sec.
I can share slides if that's helpful, Aaron.
Yeah, I'd have to do that. Sorry,
No
I put the
worries.
chat on. It stopped me from controlling it. Next slide, please. That's all right. Thank you. Thanks. As Amanda outlined, we're going to talk about the Rio OECD DAC Rio Markers for climate. And we've organised today's presentation into 4 main parts. Firstly, just start with a little bit of a background, context setting, and then a quick overview of the Rio Markers, how they work, then going a little bit further into the criteria that are used, and that's essentially a recap on the supplementary guidance that was sent in September, and then a bit of a session to talk through a workshop a little bit, how this fund will use the markers and how we'll be using them to appraise the project proposals. And so really looking forward to hearing feedback on that at the end. I'll pause intermittently as we move through the presentation for any questions. Got a little bit to cover, but please feel free to put your hand up if you have any questions as we go. Next slide, please, Emily. Yeah, so by way of background, I think as everyone is aware, for this next phase of the Water for Women fund, there's a shift in the strategic direction towards climate resilient wash. And the intention with this shift is that the fund, the Water for Women Fund, will be wholly funded utilising climate finance. And so now the fund can be thought of as a climate adaptation fund. What this means is that funded project activities are to be dedicated climate change adaptation activities. And to qualify as dedicated adaptation activities, the design of these must meet certain eligibility criteria as set out in the OECD DAC Rio Markers for climate. And we'll be talking through what they are and what they mean. So what are the OECD DAC Rio Markers for climate? Essentially, these are a system to monitor ODA, Official Development Assistance flows, that target the objectives of the Rio Convention on Climate Change. This system's been operating since 1993, but for the adaptation parts of it since 2010. The Rio Markers have evolved since that time to also be a methodology used by many of the donor countries, the OECD DAC countries, to measure and report on their climate finance commitments. So those are those commitments and pledges made through the UNFCCC agreement in 1992, but also subsequent agreements such as the Copenhagen Accord and the Paris Agreement, etc. And this climate finance aspect makes it quite an important work area. The Rio Markers, the OECD DAC Rio Markers for climate, the guidance there, it sets out definitions of what we mean by adaptation, as well as criteria for what activities or what proportion of activities can be counted as adaptation. Next slide, Emily. So the way it works is that essentially the markers, it marks or assigns a category to ODA activities. So it divides these categories into 2 main types, or what's important for us to know are these 2 categories. The first one is categorized as principal, or you can think of it as the words primary. Essentially, these are activities where the main motivation for the activity or the project is to adapt to climate change. And these activities would very likely not be undertaken, or definitely not designed in the way they have, if not for that motivation. The other category to understand is what they term significant. And these are activities where the main motivation or the fundamental driver is some other development-related objective, but these activities have been modified or adjusted as a secondary consideration or a secondary objective to account for climate change risks. And the way that the Rio Markers makes decisions or determines whether it's principal or significant is really to screen or assess these activity designs against three key eligibility criteria. And these are broadly around the analyses that are undertaken as part of the problem analysis. That's number one. It's looking at how they define and express the objectives, and also looking at how the theory of change, how the activities will actually lead to the expected achievement of objectives. I'll talk about each of those in quite a bit more detail in the next slides. But the point I also wanted to make before I do that is that for this next phase of the Water for Women fund, the fund extension phase, the aim is that all activities will ideally be categorised as principal. So what this really essentially means is that 100% of the flows that are programmed, the finance that is programmed through the Water for Women fund, will be is intended to be counted as climate finance. Next one, Emily. Okay, so the next number of slides, I'm going to talk about each of those component criteria a bit more. And an outline of those criteria were earlier provided. I've got up here a picture of the supplementary guidance provided in September. What I'll be doing here is just to recap and re-explain, I suppose, each of these criteria that we'll be assessing the projects against. And remember, we'll be applying these criteria to help us decide whether these project activities can be qualified or categorised as either significant or as principal climate adaptation projects. And again, the three criteria are around problem analysis. That is the analysis to inform the project design, is that informed by an analysis of climate change risks? The second criteria is around the objectives. Do those objectives address, either as the main part or a component part, do these objectives address in some way climate change risks or parts of climate change risk? And that third criteria is looking at the theory of change, or how we expect to achieve the climate change objectives. And so this is around, is it clear how and why the project activities are expected to achieve the intended objectives. So I'll talk through each of those more now. Next one. All right. The first criteria, like I mentioned already, is whether the project design, and looking at that section 2 of the project design template especially, whether that project design includes an analysis of climate change risks. So whether the analytical work establishes the problems and issues that the project will address, whether those problems and issues include a focus or is the main focus on climate change risk. And that analysis of risk is robust. By that, I mean, it's supported by evidence, either primary or secondary research, and that risk assessment is tailored for the geographical area of interest or where the project's working. And also that this analytical work of risks, of climate change risks, it includes an examination of capacity and the constraints around capacity to manage climate change risk. What this essentially means for this next phase is that we are reframing the project problem to include a focus on climate change risks and its underpinning causes. So it's a little bit of a reframe of how we're looking upon the problems and issues. And if the project design is to be counted as a principal project, a principal adaptation project, then it should be the case that climate change risk to the wash system is in fact the primary problem that the project is trying to address. I'm going to illustrate this with a couple of examples. First example is around that sort of enabling environment type of work, looking at wash sector planning and budgeting. Okay, so a problem analysis that is that can be categorised as a principal being eligible for principal status. A problem analysis here would be looking at the extent to which the existing wash sector planning and budgetary systems integrates climate change risk into these systems and its component parts. So it's specifically looking at the degree to which climate change is incorporated or integrated. It'll, for example, this might be looking at the analytical inputs and tools that are used in strategic planning and strategic planning processes, whether they, to what extent they have integrated or embedded climate change risk, whether these tools and processes separately examine risk for gender and marginalised groups, so the inclusive risk assessment. It might be looking at the skills of wash sector staff in climate change risk aspects specifically. It might be looking at the quality assurance processes to do that appraisal work, whether that appraisal system and those tools have climate change risk incorporated, etc. Essentially, the focus of this problem analysis is on whether climate change and disaster risk specifically has been considered. You might contrast this to a problem analysis for a project that with better fits as a significant type of adaptation. For this type of project, the problem analysis might be looking a bit more broadly at the functioning of the wash sector planning and budgetary system in a more general sense. So the problem analysis or the diagnostic assessment that would be undertaken here would be more generally around the strengths and weaknesses in the processes and the skills and tools, etc., for strategic planning, similarly for monitoring evaluation, similarly for budget preparation. And it's looking at in a more general sense, what are the issues and challenges and constraints, and then weaknesses and gaps as it relates to integration of climate change and disaster risk considerations. That's one part of the problem analysis. So for this example, the problem analysis is a more generalised analysis of sector planning and budgetary system issues, with climate change risk just being considered as one of those issues or one component part of that problem analysis. Another example might be for a hygiene related project. Okay, so a project that is a hygiene related project, if it was to be considered a principal adaptation type project, then the problem analysis undertaken for this would be quite in depth and look at the nature, the extent, and the underpinning causes of, let's say, drought events, and how these drought events affect the hygiene practices and what that means for infectious and communicable diseases. So the problem analysis here, or the risk assessment here, might look at things like the likelihood and of different intensity drought hazard events in the project area, both now or historically and into the medium-term future under the effects of climate change. It might then look at how those hazard events, what the nature of those impacts are. So looking at the exposure and the vulnerability of the hygiene behaviours and the hygiene practices, how those behaviours and practices are affected when a drought event occurs, and what does that mean for the incidence of infectious and communicable diseases. That the risk analysis might further also look at what are the barriers and the factors that are constraining different stakeholders groups, their ability or their capacity to manage these risks to hygiene during drought events, and the type of things that might be looked at here. The type of barriers to capacity might be things like a lack of knowledge and understanding of those risks, or knowledge of an understanding of how to best treat or manage those risks. For example, certain water efficient hand washing systems, or it might be looking at the barriers relating to being able to, the local market might not provide or have access to the types of technologies that are best to manage those risks, etc. And again, as a GEDSI inclusive project, it might be looking at each of these risks, the impacts, the barriers. It might be looking at those specifically for gender and marginalised stakeholder groups. So as you can hopefully see, the primary focus of this analysis is on climate change and disaster risk for the hygiene. And that we might contrast that to a project which is better categorised as significant. And the problem analysis undertaken for hygiene for a significant project might be a bit more general. It might look at what are the challenges and issues more generally that are affecting hygiene practices. So it'll be looking at what are a bit of a state situation analysis of what the practices are and what the current incidence of infectious and communicable diseases are, and then more generally exploring the key issues and things that are impeding or affecting hygiene practice. And these might be quite different to just a climate hazard event. So it might be more generally inadequate access to public water infrastructure services, including in non-drought periods. It might be a lack of awareness of in the efficacy of hand washing with soap to reduce certain diseases. Might be about access to finance or barriers to access to finance to buy enough sanitary products. And it might be about the weak community management of public water sources affecting water quality and availability, including in non-drought periods. And then as part of that, it might have a component or an aspect of the analysis which looks at drought risk. So this type of problem analysis is more generalised and includes climate risk as only one part or component aspect of the analysis. Okay. Any questions? Please feel to put them in the chat, and we will pause before we go into the breakout groups. But please feel free to also send questions through the chat. Okay, so the second criteria is around objectives, and this is building on the problem analysis, this eligibility criteria asks whether the objectives address climate change risks or a component part of risks. And so are these objectives clearly stated and expressed in terms that are meaningful and understandable? And do these objectives align and build on the problem analysis that we talked about in eligibility criteria 1? What this means for the next phase, Water for Women extension, is that we are reorienting the outcomes of what we want to achieve from the investment to include A, or ideally the, focus on climate change risks, and to be counted as principal. So that means 100% of the climate finance 100% of that finance can be counted as climate finance. To be principal for this criteria, addressing aspects of the climate change risk problem or risk to the WASH system is the primary objective that the project is trying to achieve. And similar to previous criteria, I'll run through some examples building on those same examples that we talked about earlier. So the first one might be the WASH sector planning and budgeting, that enabling environment type projects. So what the objective might be for a principal type activity, a principal type project, is that WASH sector planning and budgeting systems are climate proofed. So a real emphasis on the climate aspects there. And you might have some sub-objectives or intermediary outcomes which address those those underpinning barriers and constraints affecting risk or affecting the capacity to manage risk. And so you might have things like the strategic planning processes are risk informed. The annual budgeting planning processes are risk informed. We have enhanced technical capacity of staff to execute risk informed processes and tools. So these objectives are all expressed to have a focus squarely on addressing climate change risk specifically. A more mainstreamed or an activity that would be better would be categorised as significant might have slightly different or different emphasis. So for the same example of WASH sector planning and budgeting, this could be strengthen WASH sector planning and budgetary systems, including climate change risk management elements. And then the intermediary objectives or outcomes, they're not necessarily just focusing on climate risk. You might have things like strengthen strategic planning processes and tools, strengthen annual budgeting planning processes and tools, enhance technical capacity in these generalised tools. And then one aspect of that might be strategic planning processes are risk informed. So for this type of project, the primary objective is more general system strengthening with only a part or a component on addressing climate change risks. Next one. Emily, if questions come up, please yell out to me if I don't see them. Okay, the second example for this criteria of objectives is building on the hygiene example. So for a project of this type to be categorised as principal, you might have an objective that sounds something like this. Reduce the vulnerability of hygiene practices to drought. And some of the intermediary objectives will be about addressing the certain barriers or constraints affecting the capacity of that population to manage the risk to hygiene. And that could be around enhancing community knowledge and understanding of the risks presented by drought to hygiene, including for gender and marginalised groups. Could be something like increased market access to water-saving hand washing tools and other drought adaptation products and services. Could be around increasing access to microfinance to be able to purchase these hygiene adaptation goods and services. So here again, the primary focus is specifically on addressing climate change risks. Whereas a significant a project that's better categorised as significant might have a more generalised objective to improve or strengthen hygiene practices, and their other component of the intermediate objectives could be around enhancing awareness of hand washing with soap, access to sanitary products for low-income households, strengthen coordination among NGOs, and then one part of it might be addressing an aspect of climate change risk, for example, enhance community knowledge and understanding of drought risk to hygiene, including. So this hopefully illustrates this is an objective where is a development objective to improve hygiene practices with reduction of vulnerability to drought is one component part, a secondary objective, not the primary objective. Next one, Emily. Last criteria is around this theory of change. So this criteria is around how clearly the project explains how and why the activities will achieve its risk-related objectives. So it's checking and seeing whether activities align with those risk-related objectives and whether they further link with the problem analysis such that there is a clear, logical cause-effect pathway to achieve that change. So we can see how and why the activities or deliverables will lead to the intended change. So what this means from earlier phases is that we're adjusting and modifying the activities, what that will target and how change will be achieved. And ideally, the strategies and deliverables will target factors constraining the capacity to manage risks. That is, it's identifying and addressing the barriers or limitations that are affecting adaptive and absorptive capacity. And just to round out the examples, continuing the wash sector planning and budget example. The activities here could be, the deliverables here could be to integrate risk into strategic planning processes and tools. It's about integrating risk into budget planning and processes and tools, and some training and mentoring in these processes and tools. So you can very clearly see that it targets the component parts where integration, climate risk integration is needed most and is the greatest. And the logic then becomes, if we strengthen these parts of the system that are weak, then we expect to lead to risk-informed strategic planning and budgetary system, and those investments will be climate resilient or climate proofed. So there is an alignment with the climate risk related objectives. Whereas if we have if the design is better categorised as significant, it might look something like this. The deliverables are around more reforms to strategic planning processes and related planning tools generally, general reforms to annual budget planning processes and planning tools, and training capacity building in those generalised processes and tools. And then one deliverable might be to integrate risk into these aspects. So for this example, most activities target at non-climate related risk, and only one activity clearly aligns with the climate risk related objective. One last slide, or two more slides, and then we can break for some Q&A. I'm conscious I'm talking quite a bit. The last one is the hygiene example. So for a pure climate adaptation, for a principal adaptation project, these deliverables might be something like community awareness campaign on drought risks to hygiene. There might be an industry support package to increase the local supply of water-saving hand wash tools and other drought adaptation products and services. It might also be modification or supplementation of microfinance, so lower income or households can purchase or have finance capacity to purchase these things. So you can see that these deliverables target the barriers identified as constraining capacity to manage risks. And the logic is, if we remove the barriers, then expect capacity of the community to be able to make changes or adaptations to increase, and that their vulnerability in their hygiene vulnerability would be reduced as well. So there's a very clear, strong alignment with the climate risk related objectives. Whereas a project which is significant, it might have deliverables around just generalised community awareness about hand washing with soap, might have subsidised provision of sanitary products for low income households, and so forth, but with only one activity area looking at climate change, drought risk specifically. So most of the activities, or a majority of activities, are non-climate related issues. Only one of them is specific or a sub-activity. Last slide, and then we can open up for questions. Just to sum up this part, together, the idea is that together, these criteria, 1, 2, and 3, they can be thought of as the climate rationale. Project designs, what we're looking for in the designs, project designs should have a clear and evidence-based climate rationale if funding is to be allocated from climate finance sources. And further, climate rationale should be the central rationale of the project if it is to be funded from if it's to be wholly funded from climate finance sources. And it's these projects would not otherwise be undertaken or designed in the way they have without climate as a central rationale. So, covered quite a bit there, and I might pause to take some questions. Amanda, do you want to moderate that?
Yes, I will. Thank you so much for talking us through all those the criteria, and I think many people are sort of getting familiar with it through their design processes. Just as a small point, a couple of people did ask me about whether we're recording the session and able to share the presentation, which we are recording the session, and we'll share that presentation afterwards. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one from John is about sort of the second criteria around the objectives. So and thinking about how we phrase things in maybe a more positive light. So the question is, in terms of shaping those objectives, is reducing risk to the same as increasing resilience to, or not?
Yeah, great question. And I think resilience. It is, if we manage climate change and disaster risks, if we reduce them, we are achieving resilient development outcomes. So it is in many ways the flip side of risk. When we manage them effectively, it becomes climate resilient. One little nuance is resilience spelled RE with a CE. That's often discussed in terms of the capacity to manage climate risks. So we're strengthening the capacity or the ability of the system or the people within the system to manage those risks. So, and I think that's where a lot of the climate change policy is heading, is to frame it in those more positive terms. So if your preference is to strengths-based rather than problem-based, I strongly encourage you to put those forward as strengthening the resilience, enhancing the capacity. Those type of words might be more appropriate, but it still uses the same concepts and builds on the same analysis. There's just different options to you of whether you're reducing vulnerability, reducing risk, or enhancing capacity and strengthening resilient systems. So they alternatives for essentially very similar things.
Thank you. So Gabrielle has posed a very interesting questions about how we feel the overall fund theory of change is principal versus significant, taking this perspective. That is a great question. And I think that's something that we are working through as part of our own internal redesign process at the moment. You're making sure that we also look at this in terms of the criteria, and I think that's a really critical part of making sure that we frame all the partners' response, and that's reflected as the overall theory of change as well. Probably don't have a great response on that. I don't know if Stuart or Alison want to add anything. That's where our conversations are coming around.
Great question, Gabrielle. I think the short answer is we haven't looked at that yet, but maybe that's something that we should do.
A couple of other, sorry, Aaron.
Just to add to that, I very quickly looked at the theory of change, and some of those key things that we outline here are reflected in the theory of change. And I just wanted to highlight one of those. In our theory of change, we have an intermediary objective of around capacity. So we're just making that if we think of that capacity in terms of the capacity to manage risk or a capacity to adapt or absorb, it's got that's there. So there's some of those key considerations, key concepts that are important for resilience, I think, are there. Of course, there's room for improvement and refinement, but that's something that we will all work through together, I understand.
Perfect. So Sylvia and Akila have got a couple of sort of questions more on the terminology, and Sylvia's question is about the term principal versus significant being quite confusing, and I completely agree. We've spent a lot of time looking through the criteria ourselves, in terms of how does that sit. They are OECD DAC Rio sort of terminology. Where does that sit with sort of minimum requirements? And Akila's question is around, can we assume that significant change is driven, and in principle change is enabled and influenced?
Might have to repeat that suggestion again, Amanda, but just I sort of share those comments too. In the way that I think about it a little bit, or the way I do think about it, I think of principle as being the primary. So the primary focus, the primary objective, the primary intent of the activities, and I think of significant as being secondary. So it's a part of the problem analysis, but not the main part. It's a subpart. It's a secondary objective, and it's a component part of the activities or the secondary part of activities. So it doesn't wholly capture it, but it captures the essence, I think, a little bit. Principal, primary, secondary, significant, secondary.
Yeah, perfect. And I think, sorry, Akila's question was around, you know, is significant where change is driven, and principle is where change is enabled and influenced.
Yeah, I think so. So change is driven. You're really purposely making this front and center. The enabled, I'm not 100% on that, but I think you're bringing it into the fold. You're providing the space for it to be considered and addressed, but you're not making it front and center.
Perfect. Okay, so John has a comment here. We think a look at the fund theory of change would be a good idea. CSO designs are required to respond to or align with the fund theory of change. And at the moment, we have an existing one with climate change dropped in a few places. The presentation suggests a more significant adjustment to the fund theory of change is needed. How does the fund coordinator recommend we proceed with our design process in the interim? I mean, from my perspective, I think that the design process should continue as going into the analysis, the problem analysis, and the objective. So, we want to make sure that all of the obviously all the theory of changes align, but we do need to make sure that the projects have very complete designs that we can then align in with the theory of change. So I think it shouldn't change too much. Oh.
Yeah, I might let Stuart talk, but I think at a lot of the end of program outcomes 1 and 2, especially and 3, I think they do marry up with what we're trying to achieve as principle. And like I said, the intermediate concept of capacity is one of those. It's reflected in the intermediate objectives, maybe not as unpacked and emphasised as much as it perhaps wants to be, but what I would say is it's there. So the logic is there. You might want to unpack some aspects, but I think there's certainly enough of a framework to continue with the design process in the way that we are doing it.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll just sort of jump in here for a minute. So yeah, I think both what sort of Amanda and Aaron are saying is correct. Just in terms of building and sort of outlining some of the things that Aaron's gone in today, and there's a basis there. But all that said, we're happy to sort of go back and relook at some of these things again. I think this is an ongoing process, to be perfectly honest, where we're looking at things, we keep learning things as we go along and sort of unpack this whole process. So unfortunately, from one perspective, we're all in this and trying to learn together. And I think the core is there, but we'll go back and just see if we can kind of tweak it a little bit to try and bring out some of these things a little bit better than what they are at the moment. But I think the key thing is we're trying to work through sort of meeting those Rio markers and exactly unpacking and understanding what that means is something that we are working on together, and that's what we need to try and sort of concentrate and focus on. I hope that helps at the moment. None of this process is ideal by any means, but if you have any questions, keep asking, and we'll go back and have a look and see whether we can draw that out a little bit more as well.
Thanks, Alison. We've got one more question just before we move on from Juhai. When we build capacity to manage risks along with the resilience development, this will be understood as principal change, while any specific change in both infrastructure and behaviour will be treated as significant change. Is this understanding correct?
Not 100% correct, I wouldn't say. So if you were looking at infrastructure, and the emphasis is, say, looking at the focus is on understanding the risk to that infrastructure. It's on adjusting the building codes or the standards for construction for that infrastructure, and how it needs to be maintained and operated in the face of these hazard events. Then you can have an infrastructure related project or investment that is counted as 100%. When maybe the differentiate where it gets a little bit, if you're wholly funding that infrastructure, and so that goes beyond the adaptations or the design modifications that you make to make it climate resilient or climate proof, then that's probably where it's creeping into the significant category. But if the activities are more focused on understanding the risk, changing the design, and you're only funding a share of the actual infrastructure investment construction, then that fits as a principle. What was the other one? Sorry, Amanda.
With any specific change in both infrastructure and behaviour treated as significant change?
Behaviour, that could be a lot of different things, but just to say, behaviour and the capacity to make behaviour changes is often a big part of a principal project. So we've been looking at what factors and conditions are leading to this behaviour in the status quo behaviour, and then looking at what are the barriers, constraints, impediments, or the root causes of the vulnerability, and then by understanding that and addressing that, then it will lead to a behaviour change, and that behaviour change is a capacity or ability change, which ultimately will improve or strengthen resilience. So again, you can have projects that are emphasising or focusing on behaviour change that are principal. So it's quite nuanced and quite variable, but I think, it's a short answer. And I think if you think about it in the way that it's set out in terms of the problem, and then the objectives, and then how you're going to achieve those objectives, that gives a bit of a structured way to tease that out, to understand whether that behaviour change or that infrastructure investment, whether it's counted as a principal or a significant. Yeah.
Thank you to everyone for your questions. And what we'll do next is we'll have a look at a sort of an appraisal mechanism that we've got. So the sorts of things that we would be looking at to sort of categorise each of those three sections within the designs, and sort of what we'd be looking to see against those three sections. Following that, we will have a chance to go into breakout rooms, one for each of the three different criteria, to be able to unpack that a little bit more, looking at the content and also sort of the language, the clarity of the rubrics, as well as where we're at. So I'll let Aaron continue on, and then after that we'll get ready to jump into breakout groups.
Thanks, Amanda. Just the first slide really sets out the background thinking here. So what we'll be presenting next are 3 rubrics, and these 3 rubrics are in line with what we've just discussed, the 3 headline criteria, and those are around the problem analysis or the risk assessment. That's the first rubric. The second one is around the objectives, and the third one is around the theory of change, or how the activities will lead to the achievement of objectives. So they're structured in the same way as we've just set out, and the idea or the intention here is that we're using these rubrics as a bit of a tool, a collaborative effort to support improvements, essentially. So the idea is that we're using this in a way to help us move towards principal status, rather than using it strictly as something to determine whether we allocate funds to the project or not. So just wanted to emphasize that it's really a tool to help us progress along that path of making our designs more climate centric or focused. So it has a clear climate rationale as its central rationale. The one exception, though, I will say, is if it scores very poorly at 0, and hopefully that doesn't apply to anyone. The idea, like I just said, is that it's a bit of a way to have structured conversations to help partners progress and move their design so they do better fit and meet those eligibility criteria as being a principal adaptation project. And so we can confidently defend that 100% of this project money is for climate purposes. And as you'll see in the following slides, we've got a rubric which outlines a score of 0 to 3, and to be counted as principal, the projects need to score at least 2 across each of the criteria. So that's the goal, that's the aim. Next slide, Emily. I won't talk through this in too much detail. We'll do that in, I think, the breakout groups, and conscious that I've been talking a lot already. But the first one is, like I said, around the problem analysis and whether the risk assessment work done as part of the problem analysis is fit for purpose, whether it's adequate. So if there's little or no analysis included in the project design to demonstrate the nature, extent and underpinning causes of climate change risk to the wash sector, then that's a 0. And or if information that is included is not supported by any information, that's a 0. So if there's no real effort made bring this in, then that's probably not that's probably not what we're looking after. We need to improve that before we go forward. If you're scored as a 1, the problem analysis includes a good amount of thinking and analytical work to show the nature and the extent of the climate risks affecting the wash sector, or wash system in the project sector, and this is supported by a good amount of evidence. However, this risk analysis, might of the climate risks might not be the primary focus of the analytical work done to demonstrate or to explain the context and problems. Moreover, that it might not have a deeper level analysis unpacking or investigating the issues or the causes of drivers of climate risk as they relate to capacity. So that would be a significant. Then when we move on to 2 and 3, this is where we're rating as eligible for principal or primary. So to be 2, where a good amount of analysis is included in the project design document to show the nature and extent of the risk. It is actually the primary focus of the analysis in section 2, but maybe doesn't get full marks on understanding the underpinning causes and drivers of risk. So it doesn't really look in a material way to the barriers or limitations affecting capacity or the root causes of vulnerability. And to get full marks, and this is this is a project that's very much a principle and well designed. There's a good amount of analysis of climate risk assessment and the underpinning causes, and this is the primary focus of the problem analysis work. Next one, Emily. Is there a question there? Are climate risk assessments also expected part of activity? Very good question. I think what we're hoping is that there's some a good level of work done as part of the design to sort of frame, at least in a broad sense, what the objectives and the strategies are. But it is, I think, it will probably be likely for some projects that this risk assessment work will have to go further as, I suppose, an activity of the project to further develop the rigour, I suppose, of the risk assessment. So it's a bit of both. We want some risk assessment work to be done, definitely, at least to the level 1 for the project design, but also, you know, the practicalities and the fees. We recognise there might need to be still some more work done as an activity of the project. Is that all right? Yep. All right, Emily, can we go to the next one? We're on it. So the rubric for objectives, a score of 0, which is where the objectives include no or little reference to the concepts of climate change, risk and resilience. And if there are references included, it's not clear how this lines up with the previous work on the problem analysis. So that's a 0. A 1 is where the objectives make reference to the concepts of climate change and resilience. However, this is only these aspects are a secondary objective and is not the primary emphasis or focus of the objective statement. And for this one, there might also only be moderate alignment or the superficial alignment of the objectives with a good quality in-depth risk analysis work. When we move into the scoring of 2, remembering the scoring of 2 and 3 qualifies as principal. When we move to 2, the objectives included in the project design make a clear reference to concepts of climate change and risk and resilience. And these objectives are the primary objectives, the primary focus of the project. But where maybe it doesn't get full marks is when there's there's only moderate alignment of the objectives with some of that more detailed information included in the risk analysis. Yeah, and then the last one is where it achieves all those. Sorry. Is that a question? The last one is, where the objectives are clear and make clear reference to the concept of climate change risk and resilience. These are the primary objectives, and there's very strong alignment, and you can see how this has been built on or based on the analysis done in the problem section. Last one, Emily. And this is the last criteria. Remember, this is the theory of change criteria. A score of 0 is where the activities and strategies do not clearly align with any climate resilience objectives that are included, and it's not clear how these strategies link up with that understanding of the problem. A scoring of 1, where significant, is that where activities include and strategies include do appear to line up with the risk-related objectives, but this might not be clear for all of the activities. And so for some or all of the activities, there's insufficient information to show how the linkages between the activities and how we'll address the parts of the problem outlined in the problem analysis. And so it's a bit unclear how and why those activities will lead to the expected change or expected resilience objectives. Scoring of 2 is where the large majority of activities and strategies clearly align with the climate resilience objectives. But for some of these activities, it doesn't fully explain or fully show how the linkages of the strategies with the aspects of the problem analysis. So for some of the activities, it might be a little bit unclear how and why they will achieve or lead to the expected end of program change. The full 3 marks is when all of the activities and strategies strongly align with the climate resilience objectives. It's clear how these activities link with the problem analysis, and therefore it's very clear and explained well how each of the deliverables or strategies will serve to lead the cause-effect pathway to achieving that objectives will be achieved. So they're the 3 criteria. And what we're hoping to do now is to see if people think that at a conceptual level, whether the key thoughts, ideas and considerations are clear in making this determination of 1, 2 or 3, and if not, what concepts are not fully clear, and then maybe at a more granular level or micro level, whether you think some of the language could be improved or whether the language is clear and understandable, or which parts you think we need to edit and further develop. Excuse me.
Thanks so much for that, Aaron. We'll jump into breakout groups for 15 minutes. So each group will do one of the different criteria, and we'll have a moderator in that session as well. The link that Emily has just shared is a Google Doc, so it'll have the 3 different rubrics for each of the criteria, and just to the questions that we've got up here about it. The conceptual level, are the key considerations clear? And then sort of any language, making sure the language is clear and understandable. So within the breakout groups, we'll have a moderator to capture the feedback from the group. But when we come back to the main session, we'll just ask one person to share the one main takeaway with the broader group, just on return to make the best use of time. So Em, if you'd like to pop everyone into a breakout room, we'll go and do that, and we'll see you back very soon. recording back on. Brilliant. So thank you very much to all the teams and to everyone for your thoughts and for joining today. So I think John makes a good point. We will be sharing the slides and the recordings in the coming days at a very reasonable price. So we will also be able to share those with the rest of your team. So, but I do want to thank everyone for attending today's session and for keeping us all to time as well, to Em in the background and to Stuart as well for his work in facilitating group 3. And also thank you very much to Aaron for all his work in designing the rubric and working with us and putting together this webinar. We'll all be working together on this. And thank you very much, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful day. It's now 4 o'clock and we will thank you all, very much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.